So let's give him a big hand. And the floor, no, the platform is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear Commissioner Lin, dear colleagues of Taipei City Government, Gordon was the first one to befriend me on LinkedIn when I knew on LinkedIn when I was supposed to come to Taipei. EPA DG Madam Tai, also specialist Mr. Fan Jiang. I was really impressed by your presentation. It was really excellent. Also other colleagues of other representations. It is really a pleasure to be here. This is the second time in less than a week that I've been invited by the Taipei City Government to participate in an event that focuses on sustainable development. Last week, I attended an event on circular economy, where also Mayor Ke spoke. And this Saturday, I was sitting at my breakfast table, and I saw that it was the first time that I actually made it onto the front page of the Taipei Times. There was a picture made of that event, and I was also standing there, so I was really happy, and that actually made for the first time since I arrived here the front page of the Taipei Times. Let's have a look at the next slide. Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to talk about climate change today, a debate that is very often complex, technical, referencing baseline years, reduction percentages, all sorts of advanced technologies like CO2 sequestration. Not sure whether you know what CO2 sequestration is. I don't. But I think it's also important that beyond the jargon, we also remind ourselves why we are actually trying to combat climate change. And I think it's because it's critical for the future of ourselves, but also for the future of our children. Now, I guess that one of the similarities that Taiwan and the Netherlands share is our susceptibility to drastic changes in climate behavior, more intense rains, and unrelenting increase in seawater levels. The result of this we are already experiencing firsthand, both in Taiwan but also in the Netherlands. Here you will see a picture of the city, of a map of the city of The Hague in the Netherlands. That apartment that you see there is where my family and myself live. You may know that 1/3 of the Netherlands is below sea level. I think it was the French, Guillaume, who said that God created Earth, but the Dutch created the Netherlands. So if we don't bend the curve in terms of climate change before 2050, my apartment will be totally inundated by water. So it's really imperative that we try to bend that curve. Also in Taiwan, we are seeing the results of climate change. These floods apparently were in 2017, June the 2nd. This is the Taipei Xiaojudan. I was told, and in a few hours, because of the torrential rains, the entire street was flooded. So bearing this in mind, the real impact of climate change on our lives, I will talk today about how international agreements on climate change have been translated into Dutch policies. And I will also try to explain what is typically Dutch about our climate policy. So what I will do is talk more about governance. I won't talk about technical measures. I will talk about governance from a central government level and the way that it trickles down also to sectoral level. Yes. So all of you know that internationally there are two major milestone agreements that have driven both European but also Dutch climate policies. The first, obviously, is the climate agreement that was reached in Rio de Janeiro already in 1992. And the Rio Agreement kickstarted a process that eventually ended at UN level in 2015 with the Paris Agreement. I think it's always very useful to remind us of what the headline goal is that was laid down in the Paris Agreement. And the headline goal is to keep the increase in global average temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees. Now, the Rio Agreement in 1992, as well as the Paris Agreement, have been consistently translated into European goals, so from the UN level at EU level, and from the EU level, those goals were translated into national goals. And here you will see for the various target dates, 2020, 2030, what the various headline goals are. Of course, in 2050, At the European level, we are hoping to reach climate neutrality and also net zero emissions. What might also be interesting to see here is that if you look at the headline goal in 2030, the Netherlands has a CHG emission target, which is a little bit more ambitious than at European level. But of course, we need to work, all of us, on reaching those headline targets, which is not a small task, I guess. So, having spoken about the way that the international targets have been translated from global level to European level, I think it's time now to talk a bit about what we've done at a Dutch level. And I think that there are two key documents that lay out in the Netherlands our climate policy. It's the Climate Agreement on the one hand, and it's the Climate Act on the other hand. And together, the Climate Agreement and Act, they form the main pillars under Dutch climate policy. And I will explain and I will talk about both of them separately. The Climate Agreement first. It's a voluntary covenant agreed by stakeholders of 5 key economic sectors. These stakeholders agreed collectively to take measures within their sectors to contribute to the overall national headline goal of emission reduction target of -49 in 2030. Each of the sectors was assigned a sector-specific target for reduction to be realized in 2030, and the sector-specific targets were indicative, and they were set by an independent agency, the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, and the Dutch acronym for this would be the PBL. Now, after these sectoral targets were set, discussions were organized, were started by stakeholders from each of those sectors around so-called tables. And there were 5 tables in total: industry, electricity, mobility, agriculture, and the built environment. And I think we also saw in the other presentations just now that those are actually the key sectors where one should focus on in order to be able to really attain the goals of CO2 reduction. The process started in 2018, the process of discussions around those 5 tables. There were more than 100 parties jointly working on their table-specific proposals, and the final result is the climate agreement that was concluded in 2019 and that was endorsed by the Dutch government. Now, what is typically Dutch about this approach? And some of you may know that there is such a, let's say, consultation mechanism in the Netherlands that is called the polder model. So what is typically Dutch? First of all, it's an all relevant stakeholder approach. It's an inclusive multi-stakeholder approach. The aim is to achieve consensus, so negotiations must be acceptable for, but also accepted by all stakeholders. Measures are to be implemented on a voluntary basis by all sectoral stakeholders themselves. Now, what is the role of the government? The government monitors, but initially, in order to reach those targets per table, there is no legislative backup. So most of the measures that have been agreed by each and every table are supposed to be implemented on a voluntary basis. Of course, as a government, when you see that things aren't going the right way, you always have the possibility, the opportunity to legislate afterwards. But first, we try to put the responsibility at the sectors themselves. Now here again, you will see an overview of what are the headline targets in terms of CO2 reduction by 2030, electricity, industry, mobility, agriculture, the built environment. I think that I will not go into the various measures that are taken by these various sectors, because I think that they are kind of generic. If you look at electricity generation, of course, recourse is taken to renewable energy. If we talk about the table for industry, we are thinking about also adding a CO2 levy onto industrial activities. That, by the way, is one of the only legislative acts that are going to be taken, and which is in addition to the ETS system at European level. If you talk about mobility, obviously, then we invest a lot in alternative energy, in electricity, in hydrogen. For agriculture, I guess that just like in Taiwan, the agricultural sector is a sector which is not necessarily very proactive when it comes down to reforms, but it's a crucial sector nevertheless. And our Ministry of Agriculture has also formulated a policy for circular agriculture by 2050. So there was a lot of hope put in the implementation of that circular agricultural policy. And of course, in the built environment, also various actions are being undertaken. In the Netherlands, I've got 3 minutes left. Seriously, I'm not sure that I will be able to make that. In the built environment, there are also measures taken, for example, trying to change the use of gas into alternative measures, the use of heat pumps in order to heat houses, etc., etc. So the climate agreement, again, voluntary, 5 tables, and the measures are supposed to be implemented by the tables themselves. Then we have the Climate Act. The Climate Act is a legal bill in contrast to the agreement. It was adopted as a private member's bill in our lower house, and it was adopted in 2019. Now, the Climate Act codifies, if you will, the various targets in terms of CO2 reduction, also renewable energy, and what have you. So that is the main contrast with the climate agreement. What it does not do, the Climate Act, it does not codify how those headline targets are supposed to be reached, because as I mentioned, those will be implemented by the various tables. The Climate Act also lays down a system of governance. For example, there is an annual climate and energy outlook that is supposed to be published by our environmental assessment agency. The government is obliged, I think I need to go to the next slide. Yeah. The government is obliged to draft on an annual basis an annual climate memorandum where it looks at where do we stand in terms of reaching our targets, and do we need to change our government policy in order to make sure that we do reach the targets. The government is also obliged to draft a concrete medium-term national climate plan. The first national climate plan runs from 2021 to 2030, and the Climate Act also lays down the way that our national monitoring, reporting, and accountability obligations link into our European obligations and into our international obligations. So, conclusions. Again, the Dutch climate policy architecture is based on 2 main pillars: the climate agreement, which is voluntary, and the Climate Act, which is a law. The climate agreement is typically Dutch in the sense that it's a prime example of the Dutch polder model in action. It's based on multi-stakeholder agreement and consensus. It is not superimposed from above, and it's also thought to be more effective and efficient because we feel that it's the stakeholders themselves in each and every sector that know best which measures are most efficient, most cost efficient, and most effective. Now, of course, there are vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities is, will those sectors actually put their money where their mouth is? Will they actually do what they committed to do? And as a government, obviously, we always have the sort of Damocles, if you will, the backup of making legislation just in case when the 5 tables, the 5 sectors don't do what they're supposed to do. But still, it's a question whether this approach will work. Another question is, will it work elsewhere? Will this voluntary consensus-based approach also work, for example, here in Taiwan, where we have a different political, economic, and societal context? I actually came into this meeting thinking, especially that the voluntary element of the Dutch approach might not be applicable here, but then I was really happy to see that Taipei City is already doing a voluntary local review. So let's say the voluntary element of trying to tackle climate change is indeed something that we share in common both in the Netherlands and in Taiwan. The lady there in the back is telling me that my time is up. I had a few other slides, but we may want to discuss a few things during the discussion. One of the things that might be interesting is to see to what extent NGOs also play a role in taking our governments to task when it comes down to reaching the climate change. And I'm going to be in big trouble with that lady. Sorry for that.
Sorry for the time restrictions. Thank you very much, Guido.